what's happening? I hope y'all having a good day. We had another reaction video, and y'all already know what this is. 5 cold cases that finally got solved. So let's see what we got here. Before we start this, I like to tell y'all, shout out to DJ Ghost, by the way, because I'm taking his line for sure. If you got any, smoke, edible, drink, candy, popcorn. Before we start this, get that ready. We about to go live. We about to start this, y'all.
Hi guys. Today we'll delve into the case of a girl who disappeared from her bedroom in the middle of the night.
What the fuck?
Her sister, who shared the bed with her, told her something very strange, that a person in a wizard hat took her. This case remained unsolved for a whopping 35 years, but in 2024, the truth finally came to light.
Nah, bruh.
Jessica Gutierrez was born on December 3, 1981, in South Carolina. She was the youngest in her family, with 2 sisters and a brother. Shortly after her birth, Jessica's parents divorced, leaving her mom, Debbie, to raise 4 children on her own. They all lived in a small town called Edmond, near the state capital. It was hard for Debbie to provide for all the children without any support. But despite this, the family were pretty close-knit. When Debbie was working, the older kids looked after Jessica, and when she had free time, Debbie tried to come up with something fun to do for all of them. On June 5, 1986, their family was spending a typical summer day. Jessica, who was 4 at the time, was playing in the yard with her siblings while their mom finished up some jobs around the house. In the evening, they all had dinner together, and Debbie put the children to bed. Jessica usually slept with her mom on the same bed since she was the youngest. But on that particular day, her brother had an earache, so Debbie decided to let him sleep with her. As a result, Jessica went to sleep with her older sisters. The eldest slept on a separate bed, and the other lay with Jessica. The next morning, Debbie woke up around 9 a.m. 6-year-old Rebecca, who slept in the same bed as Jessica, went into her mother's room and asked her to make cereal for breakfast. Debbie got out of bed, left her room, and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The front door, which she always locked before going to bed, was wide open, and her dog, who usually stayed outside, was running around the house. There was also a curtain rod laying under the back window, and the protective screen had been removed from it. Debbie went into the girl's room, but Jessica was nowhere to be found. She also noticed some papers scattered on the floor. When she asked her older daughters where their sister was, Rebecca replied, "She's gone. A man with a beard and a magic hat took her." Thinking her 6-year-old daughter was just joking, the mother went to look for Jessica. She thought maybe her daughter had gone out to play in the yard, but she wasn't there. Debbie searched the entire house, hoping Jessica was just playing hide and seek.
Hell no. What would you do if your daughter came up missing and the other daughter, the sister, said a wizard took her? Nigga, I'd be...
But pretty soon, she
distraught.
realized that Jessica was
For
not
sure.
in the house. So the mother ran back to the girl's room and began demanding Rebecca to tell where her sister was.
Right.
The girl kept repeating the same thing about the man in the magic hat, and Debbie started to lose her temper. She began shouting and asking why Rebecca hadn't screamed for help if someone was taking her younger sister from the house.
Right.
After that, Rebecca finally told more details of what had happened. According to her, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a man with a beard and in a wizard hat next to their bed. He gently picked up Jessica, who was still sleeping, and left the room with her.
Hell
Rebecca, who was only 6, didn't fully understand what was happening. She was scared and covered her head with a blanket, thinking it was just a weird dream.
Malone, bro,
After lying like that for a while, she fell asleep and didn't even think to tell her mom what had happened in the morning. Realizing that Rebecca was likely telling the truth, Debbie immediately called the police.
Yeah.
Officers searched the entire house and came to the conclusion that she could indeed have been abducted. Most likely, the perpetrator entered the house through the living room window by removing the protective screen. Upon closer inspection of the area, they discovered a fingerprint on the exterior of the glass and handed its image to experts. Next to the window, the police found a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts. Understanding that they were likely due.
So Brody was a lot of cigarettes. He was sitting there puffing before he did this. He was nervous, puffing. Like what?
Dealing with a kidnapping,
Bro was
investigators installed a
nervous.
recording device on Debbie's phone. This was done in case the kidnapper would call with a ransom demand. The police listened to Rebecca's account, and she told them the same story about the man in a wizard hat. This time, she added that he had unplugged the fan and nightlight before approaching their bed. The girl hadn't seen the kidnapper's face, so her description didn't offer any help to the investigators. They focused on Debbie and brought her to the station,
What?
where they asked her to recount all the
So why y'all think he unplugged the fan and the nightlight? I know why. I feel like I know why. I felt like he didn't want his scent getting blown towards them. That's one thing. They turned off the light, that night light, because he don't want no indication of him being seen, period. Which is crazy, bro. This is
events of the
It's
previous
already
day
giving me,
in the
like,
utmost detail.
chills.
During the conversation,
'Cause
she
this shit
mentioned that
can
she
really
had a
happen,
strong
y'all.
guess who might have taken her
Pay
daughter.
attention.
Just a few days before, she had ended a relationship with a man she had been dating for several months. According to Debbie, he was quite aggressive and controlling, and he also drank pretty often. The man wasn't happy with Debbie's decision to end their relationship, so she thought he might have decided to take revenge by taking her daughter. She called him from the police station, but he denied any involvement in Jessica's disappearance. The
Damn.
police decided to investigate him further, but found no evidence linking him to the crime. They also checked Jessica's father, but he had long been living out of state and just couldn't have abducted his daughter. Meanwhile, experts ran the fingerprints found
That's
on
an
the window
old
through the
man.
FBI database,
Why
but
she
there
look
were
a
no
little
matches.
younger, but he looked.
The police decided to focus on search efforts and began combing the area around Jessica's house. It was
Know what that
located on the
mean?
outskirts, with endless fields stretching for many miles around it. Police searched abandoned buildings, forests, streams, and rivers, as well as any other places where Jessica could potentially be. The next day, the FBI joined the
Bro, I would be
investigation, but they
freaking out
still
right
couldn't
now.
find any traces of the
If I
missing
couldn't
girl.
find my
Police
son
started
or
distributing
daughter.
flyers not only in nearby towns,
Oh my
but throughout the
gosh.
entire state. The sheriff
Bruh.
also sent an airplane to survey the area from the air. The search continued for several days, and during this time, Debbie was restless. With 3 children to care for, she was unable to go out and search for her daughter. The police rarely spoke with her, only responding when she reached out to them herself.
Right.
On Saturday,
'Cause they
2
really
days
wasn't
after
looking.
Jessica's
I feel
disappearance,
like,
Debbie decided to call the
especially
sheriff
back
and
then,
ask
they
whether
wasn't
they
really
would continue the search over the weekend. She was understandably beside herself with grief, and the conversation became quite tense. Debbie accused the sheriff of negligence and lack of interest in finding Jessica.
right.
The sheriff responded that he had been searching for her daughter all night and warned that if she persisted in accusing him, he would call off his team and they would all simply forget about this case.
What?
Since Debbie's phone still recorded everything, she saved this recording. The woman
Yeah, that's what
continued
I'm
to
talking
believe that
about.
the police were not doing enough to find her daughter,
She's
so she was
smart.
losing more and more hope of finding Jessica alive with each passing day. This went on for several months until there was a rather unexpected twist in the case. 10 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, the police faced a series of crimes. A local man had broken into someone's house, but the owner used a weapon to scare him off. Then, this man stole a van and drove to North Carolina, where he broke into a home of a sleeping woman and
What
assaulted
the
her. Shortly after this incident, the man was arrested and his fingerprints were entered into the database. Once they were there,
What?
investigators got a full match. His fingerprints matched those left on the window in Jessica's house. The man was a 27-year-old Thomas McDowell, and as soon as Debbie learned about this, she immediately told the police. She knew this person. She had met
Bruh.
Thomas through relatives, and just a few months before Jessica's disappearance, she had hired him to do some work on their property. Over the course of 2 days spent at her house, he had built a shed and repaired the awning over the porch. Another curious fact was that Thomas had a beard and always wore a tall cowboy hat. This led to the thought that Rebecca, who only
Wizard.
briefly saw the abductor in the darkness, might have mistaken this headgear for a wizard's hat, similar
Wizard.
to those she'd seen in cartoons.
Okay.
But there was one huge problem for the investigators. Despite the fingerprint match, they deemed this evidence insufficient to press charges. They still
Huh?
didn't have Jessica's body, so they couldn't be 100% sure she was not alive. The presence of Thomas's fingerprints on the window could also have an explanation unrelated to the abduction. Since he worked on Debbie's property for 2 days, the fingerprint could have been left during that time.
No.
Although such a possibility was quite unlikely. During the inspection of the house, forensic experts noted that the fingerprint appeared fresh. It hadn't been exposed to external factors, such as weather, which could have visually altered it. Debbie also regularly cleaned this window where the fingerprint was found. When her children played in the yard and wanted to say something to her, they would run up to this open
Sean Combs is a monster.
I want to speak about this now because I've witnessed everything.
window,
Bruh.
lean on it with their hands, and shout. Given that the children's hands were almost always dirty, Debbie had to constantly clean the glass. Thomas had been working on her property around 6 months before the abduction, and there were no other fingerprints found there at the time of the investigation. This indicated that the man almost certainly could not have left the fingerprint back then, or else it would have been wiped out. Debbie also added another interesting fact. She remembered that when Thomas worked on her property, she accidentally locked herself out of the house, leaving the keys inside. As a result, she had to climb through the same window, and Thomas saw her doing it. But all these facts didn't convince the police. They continued to believe that there wasn't
knew
enough
how to get
evidence
in the
against
house
Thomas to press charges.
That's wild.
In 1987, he was convicted of assaulting the woman whose home he broke into and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Debbie was shattered by the fact that the police refused to charge him with the abduction, but there was
Right.
nothing she could do about it. That same year, something
Hold on, so they ain't found the daughter yet? No,
else
they ain't
happened.
found her yet.
Thomas's cellmate contacted the police and told them that Thomas had confessed to him about committing the crime. According to Thomas, he abducted a girl in South Carolina from her own bedroom to assault her. While he was committing this horrible act, the victim bit him, and in a fit of rage, he killed her. Thomas dismembered the remains, took them to a field, and left them there. Investigators in Jessica's case went to prison to speak with him, and Thomas didn't even bother to deny it. Nevertheless, he said he was willing.
My gosh. So there we get it. The girl passed away. A little girl. Bro, that's sad. And it's all because the little girl was trying to fight back while he got mad and did it to her. Bro, that's wild, bro. There's some sick people out here, gang.
willing to confess if they provide him with full immunity. The authorities obviously couldn't agree to such terms, so the police once again came up empty-handed.
Bruh,
Learning that Thomas had escaped punishment,
that's
his
sad.
cellmate wrote a letter to Debbie and told her this story. Once again, she was shocked by the fact that Thomas was allowed to evade justice, but there was nothing she could do about it. Frustrated by the police's lack of action, Debbie decided to conduct her own investigation. At one point, she located an abandoned car that had previously belonged to Thomas and inspected it. There, on one of the seats, she noticed threads and fabric fibers that matched the color of Jessica's pajamas, the one she wore the night of her disappearance. But the police didn't rush to pursue this lead. The fact that Debbie, without any special equipment or knowledge of forensic science, found fabric particles in some car seemed strange to them. In 1987, something else happened. Police from Kansas contacted local investigators and reported that they found a girl fitting Jessica's description. Her mother immediately flew there, but her hopes were instantly shattered. When she came to see the girl, just hearing her voice from the corridor was enough for her to realize it
not
wasn't
her.
her daughter. Over the following years, Debbie gave several interviews where she accused the police of ignoring the obvious suspect, but it didn't yield any significant results. In 1990, Jessica's case was featured on a popular television program about unsolved crimes. This led to a new wave of tips, but
Facts.
unfortunately, they all turned out to be dead ends. A year later, Jessica became the first missing child of South Carolina for whom an age-progressed portrait was created. Considering it was the early 90s, such technology was quite new and experimental, but detectives hoped it could help identify Jessica all these years later. Unfortunately, despite all this, the case remained unsolved for many years. In
Damn.
2007, 21 years after Jessica's disappearance,
What?
her mother once again publicly accused the local police department of inaction.
Right.
This time, she gave reporters the recording of her conversation with the sheriff, where he told her he could call his men off and forget about this case. They reached out to the sheriff, but he stated that he hadn't stopped investigating the case all these years.
Right.
The sheriff also said that after this conversation with Debbie, he not only didn't send his men home, but assigned even more officers to the investigation. Debbie also complained that for years, she had been trying to get other agencies involved in this case. but each time, the local prosecutor's office blocked these attempts. In the same year, 2007, they reviewed the case and confirmed that they didn't have any sufficient evidence, making it impossible to press charges against anyone at that time. In 2014, the sheriff faced charges related to fraud and bribery,
2014.
leading to his dismissal and a 12-month jail sentence. 2 years later, the prosecutor was arrested for a hit and run while drunk, resulting in a $1,000 fine and his resignation.
What?
In 2021, after 35 years since Jessica's disappearance, the new sheriff, named Jay Kuhn, reopened the investigation with the FBI's help. 50 agents were assigned to this case, revisiting all available evidence and seeking new leads. Eventually, they not only concluded that there is enough evidence against Thomas McDowell, but also discovered new indirect pieces of evidence linking him to the crime. His relatives and friends revealed that the man drastically changed his appearance after Jessica's disappearance,
That's what I'm talking about.
shaving his beard and long hair, and ditching his favorite cowboy hat. They also said that he smoked the same brand of cigarettes found near Jessica's home. Unfortunately, experts couldn't find any traces of DNA on these pieces of evidence, probably due to the fact that they've been
It's so
tested
long.
multiple times in the past,
That
which
is-
might have wiped out any biological traces. While all these
okay.
factors added to suspicion against Thomas, the key evidence remained his fingerprint and the testimony of his former cellmate. Eventually, detectives believed that they had enough evidence to bring the case to trial, and in January 2022, Thomas was finally arrested. At
Yeah.
62 years old, Thomas refused to admit guilt, and preparation for the trial stretched for several years.
Stupid.
It began only in January 2024, and Thomas's lawyers attempted to challenge the existing evidence. They argued that the fingerprint on the glass was left when Thomas had worked on the property. The defense also tried to use Rebecca's testimony. As we recall, Jessica's sister said that she saw a man in a wizard hat. Thomas's lawyers tried to convince everyone that the girl couldn't have mistaken a cowboy hat for a wizard's, as
Right.
they are completely different. However,
Nah,
experts
nah,
brought in by the
not-
prosecution
not
pointed
when
out
it's
that the
dark.
fingerprint was clearly
It's
fresh.
a wizard to
If
a
it had
kid.
been left a few months before
Right.
the abduction, it would have either been erased or altered by the weather. During the
Really?
trial, a former inmate also testified, repeating Thomas's confession made in prison in 1987. The prosecution pointed out that an outsider from another state would unlikely know the details of the case. Moreover, in those years, Thomas himself said he was willing to confess, but asked for full immunity, which was obviously not an option.
Nah.
The
nigga.
trial ended on February 8th, and the jury unanimously found Thomas guilty.
Yeah.
At 63 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison. For Debbie, who had been convinced of his guilt from the early years of the investigation, the outcome of this case stirred conflicting emotions. She was glad that the perpetrator was finally held accountable,
Look at
but
her
said
now.
that Thomas could have been
Damn.
arrested 36 years ago.
Age.
Instead, the police
That's
allowed him
sad.
to live a long life before facing justice. Debbie also still couldn't come to terms with the fact that her daughter's remains were never found all these years.
Right.
She, along with the new sheriff, refuses to give up and will continue the search. But the chances of finding her daughter after almost 4 decades are quite low.
Yeah. I mean, dang.
Debbie Lynn Randall was
Yeah.
born on August 21st, 1962, in Marietta, Georgia.
Now that first case was crazy, and as we know, it gets deeper the more we watch. So we about to see some. That was crazy.
Georgia. She grew up in a loving family with 2 older brothers. Sometime after Debbie's birth, her parents divorced, but her dad remained involved in their lives. A few years later, their mom married a man named Roy, and he became Debbie's stepfather. They all lived in a small apartment building in a quiet neighborhood near a military base. Debbie was a typical, cheerful kid who loved hanging out with friends and playing basketball. She also loved dolls. Debbie had a large collection and spent a lot of time playing with them. On January 13th,
Dolls look creepy as
1972,
hell.
when Debbie was
Fuck.
9 years old, she had dinner with her family.
Dolls
After
look
that, her
creepy.
mom decided to send her to the laundromat, as she had done many times before. Debbie was supposed to keep an eye on the laundry while it washed, while
Hold on. So we sending our kids to the laundromat, and they said back then was safe. Safe. I don't think the world has ever been safe to just let the kids roam That's wild. I ain't
Someone
gonna
else
lie.
from the family would help her carry the clothes to the laundromat and back home. The laundromat was just a few hundred yards away from their home, right across the street, so her mom wasn't too worried about anything happening to her. Back then, it was quite common for parents to have their kids help with chores like laundry, and Debbie even made some friends with the other girls at the laundromat. On that day, her mom wanted to send Debbie's older brother along, but he wasn't feeling well and wanted to watch his favorite TV show.
Of course.
So, the mother asked her husband to take the laundry
Brother
instead,
don't.
and Debbie went along with him, grabbing a box of detergent on the way.
Mm-hmm.
Her stepdad dropped off the laundry, loaded it into 2 washing machines, and left, while Debbie stayed to wait for the wash to finish. After that, she was supposed to walk home and ask someone to pick up the clean clothes as she couldn't carry them all by herself. Sometime later, Debbie's mom noticed that she still hadn't returned, even though the
on. What? But they said it was 100 feet. That's wild, bro. I ain't
laundry
gonna lie.
should have been done by then.
That's
It
wild.
was getting dark outside, so she and her husband decided to walk to the laundromat, but Debbie wasn't there. The employee told them that she had left a while ago and hadn't come back since. Her mom became worried and started to walk around the nearby streets with Roy, searching for Debbie.
Damn.
Soon, they noticed
Yeah.
something strange.
Yeah.
A few dozen yards from the laundromat, in the parking lot next to one of the cars, there was spilled detergent. Since Debbie was carrying the box of detergent, her mom immediately thought it might have belonged to her. They continued to search the parking lot and the surrounding area, but there were no other signs of Debbie. Some neighbors who knew the family well also joined in to help with the search, but all their efforts yielded no results, and Debbie's mom decided to contact the police.
Right.
The officers examined the area
Should've-
of the parking lot where the
I mean,
detergent
oh.
was spilled and noticed their first potential lead. The detergent was scattered just inches away from a parked car, and on its door,
I didn't
they
get the
spotted
method that
several
they was
clear
doing
fingerprints.
For this girl.
Those
man.
prints appeared fresh and were located significantly lower than the handle, which already seemed odd. The officers thought that at this exact spot, an unknown perpetrator might have grabbed the girl and touched the car in the process. They collected these prints and handed them over to forensic experts, while also beginning to search for the owner of the vehicle to confirm if the prints didn't belong to them. With no other leads, the police started combing the streets, trying to find new clues or witnesses. The laundromat employee mentioned that she hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Debbie had been sitting and waiting for the laundry to finish, then took her box of detergent and left the building. Most likely, she headed home to ask someone to pick up the clothes. The police soon found the first witness whose account immediately changed the course of the investigation. 12-year-old Sandra, along with her friend, was walking to the same laundromat, helping her carry dirty clothes. Suddenly, they saw a man grabbing a girl in the middle of the street and pulling her into his car, parked nearby the laundromat. The girl was screaming and trying to break free, but he slammed the door shut, got behind the wheel, and drove off. The man nearly hit Sandra and her friend. One of the girls started shouting after him, but he sped away. At the time, Sandra didn't realize she had witnessed an abduction. She thought the man was the girl's father or some other relative picking her up, while she wanted to stay out longer. Because of this, Sandra didn't tell any adults about what happened or report it to the police.
Dang.
Now, when she learned about Debbie's abduction, she provided investigators with crucial information. Based on her description, the perpetrator drove a dark pickup truck, likely a 1957 model according to her description. She
Cheaper creepers. Where'd you get those peepers? That's wild, bro.
described the man as young, white, with thick, dark hair. He wore a white t-shirt, jeans, and black work boots. Another girl who lived in the same building as Debbie also shared her observations. That evening, she was standing outside her apartment when a dark pickup truck drove past the building. At first, she thought it was her uncle behind the wheel, but when the driver stopped right in front of her and looked at the girl, she realized it wasn't him. According to her description, it was a white man with medium-length dark hair. She also provided investigators with a few more details about his appearance that she could remember. The girl mentioned that this man parked near their building, next to the same car where the spilled detergent would later be found. The police soon found another witness. A man who lived near Debbie's house was driving to the hospital to visit his wife. At one point, a dark pickup truck, likely a Dodge, nearly crashed into him before driving off recklessly. The driver appeared to be around 30 years old with dark hair. However, the most crucial detail was that the witness also saw a girl in his car, seemingly attempting to escape while the driver held her with one hand. After listening to all these accounts, the police had no doubt that Debbie had been abducted. They distributed information about the suspect's vehicle to all patrol units, and police artists created a sketch based on the testimonies of the three witnesses. While some officers were searching for similar vehicles and checking their owners, others organized extensive searches for Debbie. With each day, more volunteers and police officers from other towns joined in. In total, around 4,000 people were involved in the search, setting a record not only for the city, but for the entire state. Detectives also investigated various people who knew Debbie, including all male neighbors, her stepfather, and her biological father, but all of them were ruled out as suspects. Her father, who lived in the same city, learned about his daughter's disappearance at work and immediately joined the search efforts. Detectives checked previously convicted criminals living within a few-mile radius of Debbie's home, but they didn't find any suitable suspects among them. The extensive search efforts continued for over 2 weeks without yielding any results. This went on until January 29th, when several students joined the search teams and were sent to explore the wooded area several miles from Debbie's house. After spending nearly 5 hours there, one of them suddenly noticed tracks on the ground leading from the trail into the depths of the forest, as if something had been dragged there. Following the tracks deeper into the woods for about 150 feet, they stumbled upon a human body and immediately called the officers. They quickly realized that they had found Debbie Randall. She was wearing the same clothes described by her mother on the day of her abduction, a lavender dress and a dark blue zip-up jacket with a hood. However, her shoes were missing. She had socks on, but her lavender shoes were nowhere to be found. She had received these shoes as a Christmas gift just a few weeks before her disappearance, and she loved them very much. Her body was handed over to medical experts, who determined that she had died from strangulation. The victim had also been sexually assaulted. Experts found a single dark hair on her body, most likely belonging to the killer. Since DNA analysis was not used at that time, experts couldn't do much with this evidence. They examined it under a microscope and, based on their knowledge at the time, concluded that it belonged to a man aged between 18 and 30 years old. Debbie's clothing was...
What the hell? Nigga, weird.
Was also covered in dirt, and lacking other leads, detectives decided to examine it more thoroughly. They contacted a geologist and asked him to work with their forensic team. Together, they determined that some of the dirt consisted of a particular type of clay mined less than 10 miles from their city. The geologist confirmed that it was indeed the unique northern Georgia clay that couldn't be found anywhere else nearby. There were also other dirt stains, different from the first. They were traced back to another type of clay mined by a local company just 2 miles from where the body was discovered. Based on this information, detectives theorized that the perpetrator didn't kill the victim immediately. Instead, he drove her to remote areas where those types of clay were located. Most likely, he initially took her out of town, where he sexually assaulted her. Then, he drove to the location where the second type of clay was mined, killed her, and took her to the forest, dragging her body behind the trees and leaving it there. Supporting this theory were not only the clay traces, but also the forensic analysis indicating that Debbie was already dead when brought to the forest. If the perpetrator had killed her there would have been signs of a struggle around that area. The traces on the ground from the trail into the trees also suggested that the victim was already dead. The clay mining sites were quite remote and difficult to access, leading detectives to speculate that the killer might have worked there. They reached out to the mining companies, and a supervisor for one of them confirmed this theory. It was hard to believe that someone unfamiliar with that area could have taken the abducted girl there. Even the workers themselves sometimes struggled to navigate through these vast areas. Police checked employees from both companies, trying to find a man matching the description or the similar vehicle, but it didn't lead to anything. They also had fingerprints left on the car just inches away from the abduction site and compared them with all suspects, but this yielded no results either. The news of Debbie's brutal murder shook the entire city, and thousands of people came to bid farewell at her funeral. The local police department continued their efforts to find the killer and bring them to justice, but they couldn't find any new leads, hitting dead ends over and over again. Eventually, the case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives continued to work on it, checking dozens of suspects, but they couldn't establish their involvement. For the lead detective on the case, Morris Nix, Debbie's murder remained a priority throughout his entire career. The crime happened when he was just 19, and he had been involved in the search and investigation from day.
Bro, this some sick shit, gang. You hear me, family? This is some sick shit. What do we do with those type of people that do these to kids and stuff? Where we put these type of people? We shouldn't be putting them among, I mean, they killers and stuff, but, bro, they should be under the jail cell. Like they got like a walk-in, like you go downstairs, hey, you down here. We just let y'all be down here. We get y'all food, type once a day. Hey, don't let me run that motherfucker. Because, bro, they don't deserve that,
Day
bro.
one. For many years, Nix pursued various
They
leads,
really don't even deserve
scrutinized
to-
different suspects, and
Man.
eventually compiled a list of 4 men whom he considered the most
Firing
likely
squad.
suspects.
That's
When
what we
the
gonna be
FBI
on.
established a DNA database, experts were able to extract the genetic profile of the perpetrator from the hair found on Debbie's body. It was entered into the database, but no matches were found. This indicated that the killer either had never been convicted of other serious crimes, or it occurred before the time when DNA samples started being collected from such individuals. In 2015, 43 years after the murder, the case was reopened, and detectives decided to re-examine the victim's clothing using modern technology. It had been stored in the evidence warehouse all this time, and experts found biological material from an unknown man on it. However, over the years, it had degraded significantly, resulting in a partial profile. In 2018, Debbie's mother, who had hoped for decades to see the police arrest her daughter's killer and hold him accountable, gave an interview. She said that after Debbie's murder, she couldn't bear to live in the apartment where everything reminded her of her loss.
Well, no.
She moved to another city, and year after year, the lack of progress in the investigation slowly destroyed her. She also said her only desire now is to see the closure of this case before her time comes. Unfortunately, that was not meant to happen. Just a few weeks after the interview, she passed away to cancer at the age of 78, and she was laid to rest next to her daughter. Sandra, who witnessed the abduction at the age of 12, also spoke out in an interview. She said that she had never stopped blaming herself over the years. According to Sandra, she believed she could have stopped the perpetrator and prevented the abduction, even if it meant taking Debbie's place and dying instead of her. In 2019, the local police department received additional funding, enabling them to request a more detailed analysis of Debbie's clothing. This time, experts were able to extract a full DNA sample from it, but the perpetrator's DNA still wasn't in the FBI database. Debbie's father was also interviewed, and he shared that not a day had gone by over the decades when he didn't think about Debbie. He still kept a box of her old photos, hoping for only one thing: to reunite with his daughter in heaven. In 2022, shortly after the interview, he passed away. In the same year, detectives focused all their efforts on the one lead they had: DNA. They reached out to a company in Florida specializing on an innovative
bad, y'all.
DNA analysis method called
Good call.
genetic genealogy. The police handed over all the biological samples they had collected over the years and waited. Experts created a profile of the unknown man and began searching for his relatives in public genetic databases. They needed to find people who had uploaded their DNA because family members' genetic material has similarities. Modern
Okay.
tools can detect even distant relatives. After examining thousands of potential relatives of the killer, investigators narrowed down their search to a family living in Marietta in 2023. They asked them to provide DNA samples, and they agreed. The analysis showed that the killer was indeed their close relative, so experts looked into their family more carefully. They soon identified the most likely owner of the killer's DNA sample: a man named William Rose. However, there was a problem. Rose had taken his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's murder. But detectives were determined to finally close this case, no matter what. They obtained a warrant to exhume his grave, and experts took a direct DNA sample from his remains. After 51 years since Debbie's murder, the police finally got a full match. William Rose was indeed the killer. At the time of the murder, he was only 24 years old and had never been a suspect. It turned out that his relatives lived in the same building as Debbie's family. Rose regularly visited them, so investigators believed that he might have seen the girl on multiple occasions. Perhaps that evening he was headed to visit his relatives, but saw Debbie coming out of the laundromat and heading towards her home.
So the cool thing about Pi is that you can choose to just block every ad that you're seeing, or you can opt in.
Based on the testimonies of her neighbors and other witnesses, Rose pulled into the parking lot between the victim's house and the laundromat, left the engine running, got out, grabbed Debbie, and then drove north. Perhaps he immediately headed to the clay quarry, which was located in that direction. It's worth mentioning that Rose didn't have any other criminal record. Either he didn't commit anything serious besides Debbie's murder, or he simply didn't get caught. At the time the case was solved, the only living close relative of the victim was her older brother, Melvin. He attended the press conference where they announced the discovery of the culprit and thanked everyone who had worked on his sister's case for over half a century. He also said he wished his mom could have lived to see this moment, but added that she was now in heaven with Debbie.
Right.
Karen Snyder was born on July 29, 1948, in the small American town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She grew up in a very large family with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, Karen met a boy named Paul, and they decided to get married when she was just 17. Shortly after, Karen became pregnant, and in 1966, their daughter Paula was born. Even though Karen was only 18 at the time, she and her husband were ready and happy to start their own family. They moved to a town called Calumet, Illinois, where Paul's parents lived. The family settled on the same street as his parents, just a few houses away, allowing them to see Paul every day and spend a lot of time with their granddaughter. Calumet, with a population of about 25,000 residents, was located not far from Chicago and considered a very safe place to live. Karen spent most of her time taking care of their child, while Paul got a job at the local railroad. On November 12, 1966, Paul went to his night shift around 2 p.m. A few hours later, he tried to call Karen, but she didn't answer. This was unusual because she was supposed to be at home and couldn't have left their 2-month-old daughter alone. Concerned, he called his parents, who lived just a few houses away, and asked them to check on Karen. They walked down the street and knocked on the door, but there was no response. His parents didn't have a spare key, so they continued knocking for a few minutes, and then went back home to call their son. Paul became even more worried and decided to leave work early to check if everything was all right. As he approached the house, his concern grew even more. The porch light was off, and the blinds were tightly closed. This was unusual because Karen always left the porch light on for him when he worked the night shift. Paul tried to open the door with his key and realized it was unlocked. He entered the living room and was relieved to find his 2-month-old daughter sleeping in a playpen near the working TV. However, Karen was nowhere to be seen, so he began calling out her name while checking each room. As Paul decided to go upstairs, he tried to turn on the staircase light, but the switch didn't work.
Bro,
He made his way to the bedroom and turned.
I feel so bad for the women, bro. If a man wanted to physically snatch y'all up, that's irky, bro. There's women out there that's strong, but there's a lot of them that's not. I feel so bad for the women. Damn, bro. That's why y'all gotta start carrying y'all mace, y'all little jaggers. I mean, y'all something. Gotta carry something. And just stay aware. To the ladies out there, stay aware. Man.
Turned on a lamp, revealing a horrifying scene. The room was in disarray, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor lay Karen, showing no signs of life, and Paul immediately realized she was dead. Recovering from the shock, Paul went downstairs, called the police, and took his daughter outside. While he was waiting for the police and ambulance, his parents came out to the street and saw him crying and pleading for help. Paul's mother grabbed a flashlight and rushed into the house, hoping to help Karen, but as soon as she saw Karen's blood-covered body, she knew it was too late to save her. Soon after, the medics and police arrived. The doctors could only confirm Karen's death, and the investigators began examining the crime scene.
Right.
On the back door lock, they found shallow scratches, indicating an attempted break-in. However, the door was still locked, suggesting the intruder initially tried to enter this way, but failed. Next, they discovered a broken basement window with a trail of blood leading from it to the front door. Investigators speculated that after failing to open the back door, the intruder tried to enter through the basement and cut themselves on the glass,
Right.
evidenced by the blood on it. The fact that the intruder didn't enter through the basement but went to the front door suggests it was either unlocked or Karen opened it herself. In the living room, they found more blood, indicating that the attack likely started there, catching Karen near her daughter's crib. The blood trail continued from the living room, up the stairs, down the hallway, and into the couple's bedroom, where Karen's body was found. The bedroom was a chaotic scene, blood everywhere, and many items scattered and broken, indicating Karen fought back fiercely. There was a phone in the bedroom, but it had been ripped from the wall. Police believe Karen might have run there ahead of the intruder to call for help, but she couldn't. In those days, there wasn't a single emergency number like 911. Local police had their own number, so detectives thought she might have dialed incorrectly in her haste. Investigators
Oh my
also found
God.
a blood-covered light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed from the socket above the stairs. It seemed the intruder did this, though the reason was unclear. Perhaps he unscrewed it while following Karen upstairs, giving her a brief moment to try calling the police. In the downstairs bathroom, police discovered a pile of bloodied clothes and various items. Among them were a pair of pants, a bedsheet, and a washcloth. Detectives speculated that the killer used these items to wipe the blood off his hands and clothes. It appeared he also attempted to clean himself with the washcloth, or possibly tried to use it to wipe blood off the floor to cover his tracks. However, given the amount of blood throughout the house, these efforts were clearly futile. After using these items, the killer threw them into the bathtub and fled the scene. This indicated to investigators that he remained in the house for some time after the murder, although they couldn't determine the exact period of time. Detectives began their investigation and quickly ruled out the possibility of a botched robbery. The only missing items were Karen's blue wallet, containing about $50, and one of the bedside lamps, which had no significant value. Medical examiners found 124 stab wounds on Karen's body,
What
most
the
concentrated in the
hell?
chest area. Such brutality suggested the attacker had personal motives.
What
Experts
the-
identified the likely weapon as a knife with a narrow blade, similar to a stiletto, but police couldn't find it inside the house or anywhere nearby. Karen was fully clothed and no signs of sexual assault were found, but investigators didn't rule out that the attacker might have had such a motive, but for some reason was unable to carry it out. The time of death was estimated between 4 and 6 p.m. Since Paul discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer must have left the house several hours earlier. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with the victim's relatives and friends.
Several.
According to Paul's mother, Karen had mentioned being afraid to live in that house and said she wanted to move to Indiana where her parents lived. However, she didn't specify the reasons for her fear, and investigators couldn't find any more information. Karen's neighbors also provided an interesting observation. Their dog, which usually barked at the slightest noise, remained quiet that evening. With no other leads, the police turned their focus to Karen's husband, Paul. In such crimes, the spouse is often the primary suspect, so they began investigating him. After analyzing the evidence from the house, detectives concluded that the attempted break-in at the back door and the broken basement window might have been staged. The killer was likely someone familiar with Karen, but tried to make it appear as if a random intruder had committed the crime. This suggested that either Karen willingly opened the door to the killer or they had a key. Investigators began interrogating Paul while also trying to establish whether he had the opportunity to commit the crime. They considered the possibility that he might have killed Karen before leaving for his evening shift, as he had left home after lunch that day. They also checked whether he remained at work for the entire shift or if he had left at any point. Paul denied any involvement in the murder, but the police continued to view him as the prime suspect. With almost no evidence, they attempted to obtain a confession from him, repeatedly calling him in for questioning. But despite this pressure, Paul consistently maintained his innocence. Karen's funeral took place 6 days after the murder. Besides family and friends, detectives also attended the ceremony and soon noticed something weird. One of the pallbearers had a deep wound on his forehead and a bandaged hand. The police identified this man as James Barbier, a friend of both Paul and Karen. He worked with Paul at the railroad and had done some repairs in the house shortly before the murder. Karen knew James pretty well and might have opened the door for him. Investigators began looking into James and discovered that on the evening of the murder, he had gone to a local hospital with serious injuries to his hand and face, requiring stitches. This aligned with the evidence suggesting the killer injured himself on the broken basement window glass. James became the second suspect, and detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, explaining his injuries by saying that he had been returning home drunk from a bar that evening, tripped over a stump in the dark, and hurt himself on some splinters. James's wife confirmed that he came home that night drunk, with a bandaged hand and a cut on his forehead. She mentioned that he was acting weird and was visibly shaken, but she added that James was an alcoholic and frequently got heavily drunk, so this behavior wasn't unusual. When police interviewed individuals who frequented bars in Karen's neighborhood, they found witnesses who had seen James there that day. However, they couldn't pinpoint the exact times he was present. When experts finished analyzing the evidence from Karen's house, they found something intriguing. As suspected, there were 2 different types of blood. One matched Karen's blood type, while the other belonged to a different blood type, the same as James's. Although this blood type match was not proof of James' guilt, detectives decided to arrest him, hoping he would confess. They also cleared Karen's husband of suspicion, as none of the blood samples matched his type. James continued to deny his involvement, insisting that his injuries were from his fall. The police hoped forensic experts might find some additional evidence, but they faced disappointment. The fingerprints collected from the crime scene were smudged, and without DNA analysis, they couldn't make any progress with the blood evidence. Eventually, they had to release James and continued searching for new leads. Since then, investigators have looked into several other suspects and interviewed dozens of people, but the case remained unsolved for many years. Karen's murder forever changed their small town, once considered safe. Residents remembered the brutal crime for a long time and wondered who could have committed it. At the time, police did not reveal the identities of the suspects, including James, so only Karen's relatives and close friends knew of his potential involvement. In later interviews with reporters, they said they truly believed James was guilty, but without solid evidence, proving his involvement was simply impossible. Karen's father passed away in 1973, 7 years after the tragedy, and her mother died in 1977. Neither of them ever found out who killed their daughter. Paul eventually remarried, and his second wife helped raise Paula, essentially becoming the mother the girl never had the chance to remember. Her relatives decided not to tell her how her biological mother died, trying to shield the girl from the horrific details. Paula later recalled that when she started school, other kids teased her simply because her mother was dead. A few years later, understanding that she might hear the truth from others or come across news reports, her relatives finally told her what had happened to Karen. In 1989, at the age of 45, Paul passed away from health problems, never learning the truth either. For decades, there was no progress on the case. Paula occasionally gave interviews to journalists, expressing her hope to bring the culprit to justice and mentioning that she regularly contacted the local police department to ask about any new developments.
Yeah, I think she gonna find out. I think she gonna find out.
But they always replied that there were no new leads, and the case remained unsolved for many years. This continued until the end of 2022, when one day the police received a call. A 29-year-old man contacted the police department responsible for Karen's case, inquiring about any new developments. The man explained that he had known about this crime his whole life, as his grandmother talked about it since he was a kid. It turned out they were distant relatives of Karen's family, and the man was curious whether the police had made any progress in solving the mystery. He said that he had been reading newspaper clippings about the case at work and wondered if there were any modern technologies that could help solve it, and this prompted him to reach out to the police. To his surprise, the police department decided to reopen the investigation following his call. Naturally, none of the original detectives were still around, so a new team began reviewing all the available materials from scratch. They discovered that almost all the evidence, except the blood samples collected from the floor, had not only been preserved, but was also well maintained over the past 56 years. This included Karen's clothing and various items from her home. The detectives sent all the remaining evidence to the lab, where experts began examining each item with modern tools. Meanwhile, the police re-interviewed everyone connected to the case who was still alive. 16 months after the investigation was reopened, detectives received a long-awaited call from the lab. Experts had found several drops of blood on Karen's dress and extracted a DNA profile of an unknown male. The police immediately obtained a warrant from a judge to collect a genetic sample from the main suspect, James, who was still alive. They quickly got his sample, sent it to the lab, and soon received confirmation. James's DNA matched the blood found on Karen's dress. This confirmed that James, who was just 21 years old at the time of Karen's death, had been in her home the day she was murdered and had initially lied about how he got his injuries. On April 29, 2024, the police returned to James's home, and the 79-year-old man was finally arrested for murder. Upon being informed of the DNA match, James did not deny anything and confessed to the crime. While the police have not yet disclosed all details of his interrogation due to the ongoing legal proceedings, James admitted that he had known his entire life that he would eventually be caught. James has been charged with first-degree murder and was released on bail due to his age and severe health conditions. Given James's state, the risk of him fleeing was considered nearly non-existent. However, Karen's relatives were upset because they had already suffered enough seeing the killer live freely for over 50 years. As for the motive, it remains unknown. The first hearing took place at the end of May, and more details are expected to be revealed only after the trial. According to the main theory reported by journalists, James had feelings for Karen and was jealous of her husband since she married him. Additionally, James was indeed heavily intoxicated that evening, which may have driven him to commit the crime. Karen's relatives expressed their gratitude to the detectives for finally bringing James to justice. However, given his health issues, even if James lives to see prison, he is unlikely to spend much time there. Karen's daughter, who was 57 at the time of James's arrest, said she received the best call of her life when she learned that her mother's killer had finally been caught.
Right.
She admitted she had lost hope and was surprised that the evidence had been so well preserved.
That's some sad.
She also revealed that she blames James for her father's early death. Beyond dealing with the brutal murder of his wife, her father had spent the rest of his life almost certain that his close friend was responsible, and it was very hard for him to see James continue to live freely. Melissa Tremblay was born on March 1, 1977, in Lawrence, Massachusetts.
All right, y'all, we're going to end it there. I got to go to my daughter's game. I hope y'all have a good one. I appreciate y'all again, family. We out.